Hi there and welcome to the program. My name is Gus Chanetsa, and in the last episode I spoke about suffering for Christ. Now, when we suffer for Christ, we don't just do that for fun. We do that for a purpose, because God is a God of purpose. And this is what Paul said in Galatians 2 and verse 20. He said, I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. And the life that I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Okay, so he's saying, in other words, my former self, the person that I used to be, the one who used to persecute Christians and kill Christians and follow them to the ends of the earth to bring them back to the chief priests, that person has been crucified with Christ because he was a man of the flesh. He said, it is no longer I who lives, that person, that old person, but Christ now lives in me. Okay, so that old self is gone and the new has come. The new, who is fashioned after Christ, is the one that's ruling in my life. So then he says, the life that I now live in the flesh as a human being, I live by the faith of Jesus, the faith of the Son of God. And that Son of God loved me and gave his life for me. Now, Paul explains why we were in that former nature. In Ephesians 2 from verse 1, he says, and you, now he's, after telling us where he came from, he's now addressing us and he's saying, and you were just like me. You were dead in your trespasses and sins, in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, that spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of the flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and mind, and were by nature children of wrath, just like the rest of mankind. Now, let's just analyze that passage just for a moment. Okay, so we were dead in our trespasses and sins. Now, when Jesus was walking on the earth, he said that when we believe in him, we pass from death to life. In other words, from that state of being dead in our trespasses and sins to life, which is a culture of Jesus, the lifestyle of Jesus. All right. So we were once dead, following the way of the world, the course of this world. Now, when he talks about the course of this world, he's talking about a system of this world. And I'll explain why. In Psalm 24 from verse 1, it says, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell therein. Okay, so there are three things that are referred to there. There's the earth, that will not change because it is still as it was in the beginning. The only difference that's there now is that when Adam sinned, thorns and thistles, in other words, weeds, appeared on the earth, and we now have to work in order for us to eat. We now have to work in order for us to live, which is where we get this whole idea of working for a salary, working for a living. Okay, so the earth will always be there, but there's another thing called the world. The world is the systems of control or the systems of rule. It's also the governing authorities or the powers of influence that are ruling in the earth where we live. So what that means is that we were dead in our trespasses and sins, following the course of this world, under the systems of rule and control of this world, following the prince of the air. In other words, the devil, the one who influenced Adam in the beginning. Because, when the devil turned the world upside down, he didn't do it by himself. He needed man to go into the world and establish a set of systems that would keep the rest of mankind in a state that the devil himself was in. Because he was a rebel. He rebelled against God and he became self-centered. Now, there's a reason I'm saying that, because in Isaiah 14 and verse 12, this is how it describes Satan. And you'll see from this description why I say he was a selfish being. It says there, how you have fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning. How you are cut down to the ground, you who weakened the nations. For you said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will also sit on the mount of the congregation on the farther side of the north. I will ascend to the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. So you can see that with the devil, it's all about I. He's a self-centered being, and that's the nature that he passed on to Adam and Eve when they fell into sin. Okay, so everything that has been established in the world by fallen man in a lower nature, because as soon as Adam and Eve sinned, they went into a lower nature. They abandoned the nature they were created in. Okay, so that in that lower nature, they began to establish systems that were made after the pattern of Satan himself. Okay, so man became self-centered. He started looking for self-preservation, self-efficacy, self-interest, self-everything. Everything about man was about self. Okay, Adam, as soon as he sinned, began to think of himself. He said, it's this woman. He didn't take responsibility for what he did. And he said, it's this woman you gave me that gave me that food to eat. That's why I sinned. Okay, so now we've taken on that nature of Adam. It's all about us. It's all about self. All right, so now just to go back to what Paul was saying in Ephesians 2. Now, he says, we all once lived as sons of disobedience at one point in our lives, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind. Now, here's the thing about the mind, which is also part of the soul, which is the mind, the will, and the emotions. Okay, here's the thing about the mind. The mind is what is targeted by the systems of the world. The mind is what goes after cultural diversity. The mind is what goes for the experiences that are being promoted in the world, like travel and fine dining and adrenaline rush and things like that. That's what the mind goes after. Now, the body works in conjunction with the mind and goes after things like food, comfort, and pleasure. Okay, so whilst the mind is the one that wants luxurious living, for example, it's the body that actually indulges in that living. So it's the body that wants the pleasure, the one that wants to experience what the soul is setting up for it. Okay, so we once all lived there, carrying out the desires of the body and mind. But Jesus said that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believed in him would not perish under the systems of this world, carrying out the desires of the body and mind, okay, under the influence of the systems that have been created by man, would not perish under those systems, but would have eternal life, living like Jesus. Now, that was John 3 and verse 16. In verse 17 it says, for God didn't send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. That's that same world that comes from the Greek word cosmos, which means the systems of control, systems of rule, governing authorities, powers of influence. So that's what Jesus came to save. He says, so that the world through him might be saved. He came to save the world. Now, one of his disciples, Paul, the one whom he called specifically to take the message beyond the children of Israel, to the kings and to the Gentiles. That's all of us. Okay. Now he chose Paul because Paul had a specific set of skills that God himself had given him. Now, when Paul was writing, he said this in 2 Corinthians 5 from verse 17 and 18. He said, all this is from God. In other words, all this, the change from the old self to the new self, all that is from God. It's a process, but he did it for a reason. Because through Christ, we are reconciled to him. In other words, Jesus first reconciled us to himself so that we could go into the world and reconcile the world back to him. All right. In verse 20, it says, in that state, we are ambassadors for Christ. So the purpose or the reason why we are here suffering for Christ is so that we can reconcile the world back to him. Like I said, God is a God of purpose. He didn't just put us on this world to just enjoy ourselves, to just have a job for the rest of our lives, build a house, have nice cars, send our children to good schools, die, and then go to heaven. No, that's not why Jesus came. Jesus came as a God of purpose to establish something in this world. Because in the beginning, the world was turned upside down. There was a world. There was a governing system at the beginning, which was under the control of God, under the control of Jesus. All right. But once Adam and Eve sinned, they fell under the influence of the one who deceived them. So he set up an alternate system, an alternate governing authority, a system of control. All right. So Jesus came to take us back to the original world. All right. this world that's in existence right now, he wants to turn it right side up. He wants us to be involved in that process, okay, of reconciling everything in the world back to him as ambassadors for Christ. Now, there's another disciple of Jesus who spoke about the world. He had the understanding that all of them who were followers or disciples of Jesus separated themselves from the world to be his disciples. Because remember, all of them left their jobs, they left their vocations, they even left their families to be a part of what Jesus was doing for the next 3.5 years of their lives. Okay, so they separated themselves from the systems of the world so that they could learn the system of Jesus. Because remember, Jesus said, you can't serve two systems. Either you'll love one or you'll hate the other. Okay, so they are separated from each other. They are fundamentally opposed to each other. They are totally different. They are so different that you can't live with one foot in the world and the other foot in the system of Jesus. You've got to separate yourselves. And when Jesus called his disciples, they did that. They separated themselves from that world so that they could learn his culture. You know, they couldn't have learned that culture of Jesus if they were living as fishermen, fishing during the day and then following Jesus by night. They were never going to see anything. They were never going to experience anything about the way Jesus is. Okay, so they were required to separate themselves from the world so that they could learn the culture of Jesus. All right, now while they were learning the culture of Jesus, John, the writer of the Gospel of John, said this in 1 John chapter 2 from verse 15 to 17. He said, do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. So here, John picks up on that theme of the world being a system of the devil, a system of control that is under the influence of the devil. It's being ruled, it's being carried out by man, but it is man under the influence of the devil. So he's saying, do not love that world. Because when Jesus called them, he said, love one another as I have loved you. So he wants them to operate in this world that we live in with his culture, with the kind of love that he showed them, which is a one another kind of love, rather than a selfish kind of self-centered love. All right. So he says, if you love the world in the way that the world is, with selfish, self-centered people who are after self-preservation, all right, then the love of the Father, that other-centered love of the Father, is not in you. Then he goes on and says, for all that is in the world, in other words, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. There he's just talking about the fact that your eyes are the ones that are being tempted. Every temptation comes through the eye gate first, because you have to see the thing before you want to indulge in it. Okay, so all that is in the world, everything that is being promoted in the world, goes after the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh. Because once your eyes see it, then your flesh wants it. And then after your flesh wants it, it then acquires it. Because in this world, it is about accumulating things, accumulating possessions. And once you have those possessions, you're proud. Because the fact of the matter is that in the world, you are judged as being successful by the amount of things that you possess. Right? So it's those possessions that give you pride, or the pride of life. Right? So all those things that are in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, those things are not from the Father. They are of the world itself. In other words, they were developed by man under the influence of the devil, right, who is a self-centered being, and man developed this culture in the world where it's all about I. Now this world is passing away. It's going to pass away. It's going to be destroyed by fire. But he who abides in the Lord abides forever. In other words, he who operates in the system of Jesus, the system of God, will live forever because he has separated himself from the world. Now James, who didn't actually walk with Jesus while Jesus was alive, but became a disciple of Jesus after he ascended into heaven. James became a significant leader amongst the Jews, amongst the New Testament believers. And this is what he said in James 4 and verse 4. He said, you adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God. In other words, friendship with the world makes you an enemy of God. Now, he says adulterous people because, an adulterer or an adulteress is someone who is unfaithful to their spouse. All right. Now, the Bible also talks about us being the bride of Christ. So if we're the bride of Christ, then we have occasion by living in this world to be adulterous. In other words, to start following things of the world rather than the things of Jesus. When we do that, then we're an adulterous people, to whom he says, do you not know that friendship with the world, this world that is the systems of control set up by man under the influence of the devil, if we are under those systems, if we are participating in those systems, benefiting from them, then that makes us enemies of God, because Jesus was very clear. There are two systems operating in this world, and you can't serve both at the same time. He wants us as his followers to make that choice, to follow him and follow his system, be a part of his kingdom that he came with, rather than be a part of the systems of the world. We're always going to be living in this world. We're not of the system of the world. We're not driven by the culture of that world. We're driven by the culture that Jesus came with. Now, Paul also talked about this in Romans 8, verses 5 to 7. And he wanted us to know what is behind us being so attached to the world. He said, for those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh. Okay, so somebody who's in the flesh is somebody who's operating body and mind totally independent of God. All right. So if you're independent of God, that means you are following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, who is leading the sons of disobedience. Okay. So when you're in the flesh, that's what you're doing. You're living according to that culture. But those who live according to the Spirit, he says, set their minds on the things of the Spirit. In other words, the things of Jesus, the culture that Jesus established while he was here on earth. For to set your mind on the flesh is death. In other words, if you set your mind on following the things of the world that are being promoted by the systems of the world, okay, then you will be dead in your transgressions and sins. You will be there. That's where you will live. But if you set your mind on the Spirit, you will have life and peace. And that word life is from the Greek word zoe, which is talking about the God kind of life, the kind of life that Jesus lived. Right? Then he ends that passage in verse 7 by saying, for the mind that is set on the flesh is hostile to God. Now, that's a very interesting statement, because if you're living according to the flesh, then that means you're living according to the systems of this world. And those systems of this world were set up by the devil, who, by the way, is an enemy of God. All right? He wants to oppose everything that God does. So what he's doing, what his purpose is to separate everybody in the world from God. That's why God loved the world so much that he sent his son. So if our mind is set on the flesh, because of the culture of the systems of the world, we become hostile to God. We can't be a people who is in love with God if we're under the systems of the world. So when you're hostile to God, it is impossible to submit to his word, to submit to his law. And the law of God in this dispensation is all the words of Jesus. Okay, because Jesus came to establish the kingdom that we are now a part of. All right. And every word that he spoke makes up the constitution of the kingdom of God. I've spoken about that before, so I don't need to go there again. All right. So when we are set on the flesh, we become hostile to God, because the systems of the world cause us not to want to live in a culture of obedience, a culture of discipline. All right. Because the culture that the devil brought is a culture of anarchy, a culture of disobedience. All right. So when you're in that culture, there's no way you will even want to be under submission to the law of God. You don't have the ability to do that, because those systems that you're under are so powerful, they're so alluring, that they cause you to just reject the culture of God. Even as a believer, do you know that as a believer, you can confess Christ, but still be dead in your transgressions and sins, because there's a part of you that is still connected to the systems of the world and still depends on them. All right. So if that's the case, then you are showing that you don't have the ability to separate yourself from the systems of the world. Remember, James said, you become an adulterous people Because remember, Jesus, I keep repeating this. Jesus said you can't serve his system and the system of the world at the same time. If you do, that makes you an adulterer. All right? And when you're an adulterer, that means that you're making yourself an enemy of God. He wants us to be so devoted to him that we will only be participating in the culture that he brought for the purpose of restoring everything that is in the world back to him. So, the question I asked at the beginning is, why do we suffer for Christ? What's the point? Because you can't be a part of the solution, in other words, of reconciling the world back to God, if you are part of the problem. Einstein said it this way: you can't solve a problem at the level it was created. Now, what I've been saying today is that man was brought down to a lower nature for him to live the way he's living today. The method that the devil used to deceive man was meant to bring him down from the nature that he was in, to make him operate at that lower nature. So it was at that lower nature that he was under the influence of the devil, and he established all the systems that are in the world, the systems that are against the systems of God, the systems that are contrary to the original nature that Adam and Eve had. Because they did operate at a higher level before, but they were brought low. So for us to be able to take the whole world, because God loves this world, he wants this world to be saved, okay? The systems, he wants those systems to be changed, to be saved, all right? For us to be able to do that, we have to operate at a higher level. Let me give you a simple example. We know that gravity is something that is applicable to all of us who live on the earth. All right? If we jump up, you're going to come down back to the earth, because the law of gravity is at play when you jump up. So if you want to be able to fly and therefore negate the power of gravity, then you have to go to a higher law. And that's the law of aerodynamics, which operates at a higher level than the law of gravity, which keeps you stuck to the earth, which keeps you connected to the earth. Okay? In the same way, for us to be able to change this world, for us to be able to reconcile this world back to God, we must be operating under a higher law, the law of Christ. Because remember, Paul said we once were stuck in that way of life, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, as children of disobedience. We were once there, operating in the lower nature. But now we've been put on a higher level. We are fashioned after Christ in true righteousness and holiness. That's the only way that we can actually reconcile the world back to God. That's the reason we suffer for Christ. Because, if you're enjoying or benefiting or participating in the systems of this world, not all of the systems of this world are bad. But in the words of Jesus, in the culture of Jesus, he set out what is good and what is bad. That's why the words of Jesus form the constitution of the kingdom of God. It's in his word that we find out what is acceptable to him under his kingdom and what is not. Right? What is acceptable, what makes up the culture of the kingdom, is in the words of Jesus. All right? So we can only change this world when we start operating within that culture of Jesus, that culture of being other-centered, and not in the culture of each man for himself, the culture of self-centeredness. There's no way for us to change this world as self-centered people. How can you be other-centered? How can you think of the poor? How can you think of helping people as a self-centered individual? That's not possible. All right? That's why the two systems are opposed to each other, because they appeal to different aspects of our nature. The culture of Jesus appeals to the nature of being other-centered. That's why the New Testament is full of one another scriptures, which were led by the first one that Jesus said. He said, love one another as I have loved you. When you do this, the whole world will know that you're my disciples. Okay? And then those disciples of Jesus went on and wrote letters, and they started to tell us what one another means. That's why there are so many, over 50 one another scriptures, because they're trying to help us to shift to a higher culture, all right, to supersede the lower culture that has caused this world to be what it is. Listen, this world is going to hell in a handbasket. If you look at how the world has been since the internet was established in the early 1990s, you'll see that since then, the rate at which the world is deteriorating is now 100-fold. You just have to look around. You just have to see what's on TV. Just have to see what's on Netflix or what's on your satellite network. The world is clearly degenerating. I mean, I was a young person in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, okay? And things were different back then. I mean, the internet may have been established in the 1990s, but I only became aware of it and started using it much later on. So we were not open to the temptations that the young people of today are open to, because the temptation is right at your fingertips, and the systems of the world are designed to tempt us. Okay, if you look at the world right now, every individual, just about every individual, has the world at his fingertips. Okay, you can just open your device and you are open to every evil thing that the world is putting out in front of us. Now, the thing that I struggle with is that there are so many people who are called influencers. They are on YouTube, they are on TikTok and other platforms. All right, but they're not using the influence they have to lead people into the culture of Jesus. Many of them are influencing people to participate and remain in the culture of the world. Now, we as Christians, we are the ones who are the influencers. We are the gatekeepers of the culture of Jesus. We must go into the world and show them that culture. We must demonstrate the culture of Jesus. We don't have to join them to change this world. We just take our new culture into the world. Because remember, when Jesus was here, he didn't join religion to change religion from within. He just brought a new system. He told us he didn't come to establish another religion. He said, it's my Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. So he came with the kingdom. He established the kingdom, and he called all of us, his disciples, to become pupils, to become scholars of his word and his nature, so that we could then go into the world and establish this new culture. God is a God of purpose, and he wants this world to be conformed to him, to be patterned after him. There's no ambiguity in that. If you read the New Testament with that understanding, you will never go wrong again.